Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A new House Oversight task force is investigating how organizations handle issues like free speech, DEI, and federal funding. With hearings now underway and a tight deadline, the focus is shifting from policy debates to how these decisions are made and documented. Here for a look at what that process actually looks like are Kim Hamm and Carlos Uriarte, co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Kim and Carlos, it's great to have you both on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us. We're really happy to be here.
Kim, let's start with you. Congress sets up task forces all the time, but this one, the Defending Constitutional Rights and Exposing Institutional Abuses, seems to come with a pretty broad mandate around free speech, DEI, and immigration programs. From your perspective, what are you seeing that's really different about this task force?
Well, in many ways, this task force is just focused on the same key issues that other Republican-led committees have been investigating in recent years. In some ways, it's a clearinghouse for these issues. I think what's interesting and important is when it's happening. This is happening in the lead up to the midterms. This task force is only authorized through mid-November, and they've chosen as a head of the task force a young Republican member who has a number of viral moments at hearings and on social media, who I think is seen as a good messenger to bring some of these issues that are being investigated by all the committees to the people in advance of the election.
So do you have the feeling that it is going to be more spectacle than substance?
Well, I think it's already been substantive. And, I think the intent of what the task force chair has said and the chairman has said is to come up with policy recommendations. But I do think the messenger here is someone who gets a lot of attention for being, effective and aggressive at hearings. And that was a deliberate choice.
Carlos, with the setup that Kim has just given us, when you look at the scope here, who should realistically assume they might get pulled into being a witness for this task force?
Yeah, so far they've really started with focusing on the state government entities as targets for the investigative requests. We have other private sector individuals coming in for the hearings. But, it's going to be the full suite of potential targets, companies, universities, nonprofits. As Kim said earlier, a lot of these investigative requests or investigations are continuations of issues that Republicans in Congress have already been looking at. And so, I think those same entities that have been seeing these requests over the past few months are going to continue to see interest, including from the task force.
So, Kim, this sounds like there may be a parade of repeat witnesses, but for folks who haven't been through this before, walk us through what actually happens. How does this inquiry begin and how quickly does it escalate?
Well, in a typical investigation, you might initially get a letter from the chairman requesting documents and information. You may get a request to come in for interviews or briefings. The committee might issue subpoenas if they feel that the documents or information isn't coming in quickly enough. And then there's a hearing, and you might see some interim staff reports or final committee reports. That said, this one has to move very quickly, right? It's only been authorized, as I mentioned, for 6 months. And the first letter that they sent was in mid-May. They've already had a hearing that happened on June 3rd. So for this one, I think we should expect a pretty compressed timetable and for the task force to be following up on letters and demands for information very quickly. The chairman of the task force has also already said that the subpoena authority is on the table for them, and I think we should look for that as well.
Does that pace or pressure cause any concerns around the lack of normal legal protections?
Well, that's always a concern with congressional investigations. Witnesses and targets retain their constitutional rights, but the procedures are so different. And some of the, typical things that would be available, like judicial review and things like that, are quite different. And so when things move quickly like this, I do think people have to be on guard and careful about how they're responding.
Carlos, then let's follow on what Kim just talked about. How is a congressional task force investigation different from, say, a DOJ or an SEC investigation? And how do organizations need to prepare differently?
Well, congressional investigation, as you alluded to, is not like other kinds of investigations. They oftentimes happen in very public ways. They move very quickly. And because so much of the investigation is happening in the public sphere, and because there's no norms around confidentiality, companies should expect that the information they share with Congress, will become public, even if not immediately, at some point in the future. Another way in which they're very different is that there's no neutral arbiter of the facts. To the extent that there is someone to appeal to, it's going to be, through those public media narratives that the organization can get their own facts out into the public sphere. But Congress is going to have a lot of prerogative in terms of how that plays out. And there's no one to adjudicate disagreements. At the end of the day, the committee gets to decide so much of how things proceed in a congressional investigation. And so, understanding the norms around congressional investigations and understanding what rules do exist to help govern those congressional investigations is really important, because that's where companies going through these investigations will have leverage and have the ability to, help push back where necessary on Congress. But again, these are very different than other investigations. And so, I think it's important for any organization facing congressional investigation to know, where to turn to when they get these types of requests, knowing that it's going to be a different experience for them than other executive branch investigations.
I'm speaking with Carlos Uriarte and Kim Hamm. They are co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Kim, let me come back to you. We touched a little bit at the beginning of our conversation as you were describing this task force on whether it was spectacle or substance, but there are pretty significant policy issues on the table here. DEI, speech, program integrity. How much of what they're hearing already and what you expect them to tackle will actually inform future policies?
Well, a congressional investigation at its core is not a law enforcement investigation, and the Supreme Court has been very clear that it cannot be seen as a law enforcement investigation. The actual committee that this task force sits under itself has a very narrow legislative mandate. It is primarily an investigative committee, but the way it works is that its findings would be used by other committees for legislation. We are very late in a Congress, so any legislation that would come out of the findings of this task force we're looking at potentially the next Congress. The chair of the task force himself has said that the goal is to create policy recommendations for the broader Republican conference. But he's also said that the purpose of the hearings is to stop fraud, for example, and to build a case that DOJ can take up. So it's important for people who get caught up in this to understand that, these findings can be shared with the Department of Justice and that there could be these parallel investigations happening at the same time.
So, Kim, let's follow up with the organizations that, as you said, might get caught up in this investigation or these hearings. What kind of decisions or practices in their own organizations are most likely to draw the attention of this task force?
Well, it's really the same issues that we've been seeing for the past few years. And, those same, corporate practices or institutional practices around DEI, around allegations of bias or content moderation, those are really the same issues. And so, I think companies, institutions, colleges are already kind of aware baseline of that. I think from a decision point of how you deal with this task force, the timing is really important. What degree of cooperation do companies or institutions want to have right now, given that it's late? There really are these competing pressures given the timing. The target of an investigation wants to run out the clock because they want to see what happens in the election. And the committees want to get something out in October. And the incentives can be different regarding cooperation if you think that there's going to be a majority change in the House. So while the types of activities the companies have been engaged in are the same types of activities that have been investigated really since the start of this Congress, how companies or institutions respond to the task force is informed by the timing here.
And Carlos, let's follow up on that because Kim's described this tension. Do I want to be responsive and timely? Do I want to kind of run out the clock here? If you think you might be called in by this task force, what should you be doing now, maybe before you even get a letter?
We work with a lot of organizations who know that they are potentially going to be the target of an investigation because of the nature of their work and the nature of the types of investigations we've seen from Congress. And for a lot of those organizations, one of the things we'll do is work with them on conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. And that's something we can do under privilege, which I think is incredibly helpful. And it's an opportunity to look at a whole host of practices across the organization, including corporate hygiene around internal and external communications. And what you can do is to really understand, where your vulnerabilities are as an organization, what are the potential, areas of concern from a risk perspective, and then to take steps, in collaboration with counsel to mitigate risk to the organization so that if you get a request, you have a plan of attack for how you're going to respond to that request. And I think the companies and organizations that have gone through that exercise, who have a plan before the request even comes in, are best situated, I think, to take advantage of the kind of strategic considerations that Kim walked through earlier, because they already know the sum and substance of what they want to say. It's just a matter of, what is the best way to engage with Congress through the investigation.
And Kim, as these hearings get underway, what are you watching for to see how aggressive this committee is actually going to be?
Well, we're watching closely to see how many more letters come out, how quickly they use the committee's subpoena authority, if that happens, but also watching the hearings themselves. As I mentioned, the head of this task force is a young Republican member, has a reputation of being very prepared at hearings, very direct, very aggressive questioner, a lot of viral moments. We would expect that to be the tone of these hearings going forward. And in fact, in the last hearing they had, their first hearing, one of the witnesses said that his question nearly brought her to tears. And so I think we will expect to see more of that type of questioning.
I've been speaking with Carlos Uriarte and Kim Hamm. They are co-chairs of Morrison Foerster's Congressional Investigations Practice. Thank you both for joining me and walking us through this interesting opportunity.
Thank you. We really appreciate the time.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.